Hi, today I'm hosting Adam Raykar, the editor-in-chief of New Eastern Europe magazine. Mr. Raykar, thanks for joining us. Let's start with the third summit of the European political community that took place a few days ago. How do you assess this format?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. The European political community, I think it's still a relatively new format, and we're still learning what it can do and what the possibilities are. As we know, it was founded or announced by French President Emmanuel Macron back in 2022. And I think there was a lot of skepticism in the beginning, unsure what this format can do, as opposed to other formats that already exist. And I think, from our perspective and from the perspective of the region, and I'm sure from Armenian perspective as well, there were a lot of questions about whether this format was going to try to replace other formats like the European Neighborhood Policy, and in particular the Eastern Partnership project or Eastern Partnership Program. And so I think for the moment, it's kind of we have to see what this political community can do. But I think there are some advantages to it that have already emerged after the third summit. We've now had three summits in the span of just 2 years, so I think that's number one, an important sign. But number two, it really is like the European Union's recognition that Europe is much broader than just the European Union. So it does invite, the neighbors of the European Union to be a part of this European political community. So there's this broader understanding of what this community really is about, and inviting the neighbors, including some who have recently left the European Union, the UK. I think, it's another way to engage in these countries in broader European topics. Um, so I think there's some positive there. I would say that it also is an opportunity to manage some of the fatigue within the European Union towards enlargement, which has not really happened for quite some time. And this is a new way to engage countries, many of which do want to be a part of the European Union, but cannot because of for the many reasons. I'm sure we'll get into some of these discussions today. But I do think that it's also important to see how the European political community is already evolving to be a format for trying to at least resolve crises that are, a part of the European continent. And, we've seen already the engagement in Kosovo and Serbia. Of course, the whole situation with Nagorno-Karabakh, there has been attempts there, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that because unfortunately that wasn't the most successful outcome of Grenada from the most recent summit. But generally speaking, I think that there are some opportunities, and I think overall I would assess this as a positive development, even though I initially personally was very skeptical of what this European political community could mean.
So, Mr. Raykar, last year in June, the EU Council granted Moldova and Ukraine the status of a candidate for EU membership, but only the European perspective was confirmed for Georgia. Did Kiev and Chisinau manage to justify the trust of the European Union? And Georgians often call it an unfair decision because they claim that Tbilisi is ahead of those two countries in terms of reforms. To what extent was that decision justified, and what impact did it have?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, and it's quite complicated because there's a long process that we have to look at here. All three countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, have already signed their association agreements with the EU, which they believed have put them on the road for getting this candidate status. And the fact that Moldova and Ukraine received it and Georgia did not, I think, is a little bit concerning from many perspectives, especially also not just from the Georgian perspective, but I think also from the regional and from Brussels perspective. We should keep in mind that Georgia has done a lot to try to focus on reforms. My opinion is that that there are, like the key element to the decision in June last year to award Ukraine and Moldova the candidate status was very geopolitical. It's certainly related to Russia's war against Ukraine, and the fact that Ukraine is basically right now fighting to defend itself, but also to defend the European values that it believes it wants to be a part of the European Union. So I think that in Moldova being very close and also affected by largely by the Russian aggression, I think that Brussels decided to take the step and give them candidate status so that they can prove also that there is progress and that this geopolitical that it is much more of a geopolitical decision. So in terms of Georgia, I think the re- the reason why Brussels decided not to give the candidate status to Tbilisi largely has to do with some of the more recent developments that are taking place in Georgia. In particular, some of the concerns I think that Georgia, at least the Georgian government, I think it's important to separate society approach towards European integration and the government, the Georgian Dream-led government approach, which is opening a few gestures to Moscow and to Russia. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think there was a lot of concern in Brussels. Which direction does the Georgian state really want to go? So I think that we should keep in mind that the Georgian society is very pro EU. It does want their country to be a member of the European Union. And this, I think, by not giving candidate status, Brussels was trying to apply some pressure on Tbilisi to meet the demands of its own society.
And the domestic, as you mentioned, the domestic political developments taking place in Georgia are also in the center of your attention. It's announced that the government of Georgia has fulfilled only 3 of the 12 recommendations by the European Union, and the impeachment process of the President Zurabishvili has been also launched, which is not, let's say, is not clearly understood by the European partners. In your opinion, what will all this lead to? What will the year-end decision of the European Commission on granting Georgia the status of candidate for EU membership? What will be the year-end decision?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's difficult to say. I do believe that the impeachment process of the president is very concerning, and Brussels is watching it very closely, and is can be interpreted as an attack on the president's pro-EU agenda, because we know that the Georgian president has been pro-EU, has been trying to go to the EU countries, to Brussels and other big EU states to promote Georgia's integration with the European Union. And then the Georgian government wants to punish her for that. At least this is the interpretation in Brussels and many European capitals. So this, I think, will have a huge impact on the decision on whether or not Georgia will finally get the candidate status by the end of the year. I'm not sure yet which direction this will go. I think there is a chance that the EU might give the candidate status because there is a lot of fear that Russia is gaining more influence in the country. And if Georgia gets the candidate status, this would be an opportunity to kind of counter the Russian influence in the country, and maybe convince policymakers and leaders in the country that that they should not give up hope that the European path is still open for them. Because as I said earlier, the Georgians themselves are they're very they're very for their country to join the European Union. So really the responsibility right now lies within the government. And these 12 points, if you look at them closely, some of them are very difficult to understand, very vague, not really concrete. So I think they can be interpreted in different ways. So there may be an opportunity. This may be an opportunity to try to build a new path for Georgia to re-engage with Brussels. So I'm trying to stay optimistic.
And until recently, rather cautious and rare announcements were made about the prospects of expansion of the European Union. Let's say pessimistic forecasts prevailed. In recent months, however, a change is noticeable. It was already clearly said that the European Union should be ready for the expansion already by 2030. And we are talking not only about the countries of Eastern Europe, but also about the countries of Western Balkans, whose accession process seemed to be suspended. With what factors would you explain such a change of approach in the European Union?
Well, I think the number one factor which has really changed the European Union's approach to its neighbors and to enlargement, it has of course been Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The aggression against Ukraine, I think, showed Brussels that that the status quo was not sustainable. That things cannot go in the same direction they've been going for a long time. So Brussels and the European Commission had to make a decision how to react to this. What is the role that the European Union should play in the geopolitics of its own neighborhood, of its own continent? And we know that the European Commission, the von der Leyen Commission, wants to be a geopolitical commission, wants to have an impact and shape at least the geopolitics of its continent. And with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it can be interpreted as a failure of the European Commission to play an important role. So I think their reaction was, okay, we should bring back the discussion on enlargement. And we know that the states that want to be members of the EU, they've been pushing for this for a long time. And the biggest factors of enlargement not going forward have largely been internal in the EU. There's been a lot of pushback against enlargement inside the EU, but at the same time, I think fears are growing that in many of these countries, and I think particularly in Serbia, which is one of the leading candidate states, which has been doing a lot of the reforms in previous years, they are starting to have their own fatigue and basically believing that they will never get into the EU. It's just one big waiting room, and it's not going to happen. And I think the EU finally recognized that they have to make some moves. So announcing that 2030, I think it's ambitious. We will have to wait and see how it will go. But it is positive as long as the momentum can continue and that the EU can actually engage in these countries and help them on this process and actually create a roadmap for what 2030 enlargement really means. I think that will be really important in the next year or two.
And Mr. Rakardis, for you, what countries have the greatest chance to join European Union by 2030? And won't that, let's say, complicate the decision-making process in the Union even more, considering the fact that there are, let's say, some countries which even today are active in using their right of veto?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of factors that we have to still consider, and we cannot take it for granted that 2030 will come and there will be a new enlargement process, at least from today's perspective. A lot can change. But if we do look at what countries have probably the best chances, if we want to say probably the safest path from today's perspective, Albania and North Macedonia are probably the closest to getting European Union membership and could be a part of this enlargement. I think that it's possible that in the year 2030, that there are many EU member states will not be ready to accept a large enlargement process. So there might be just one or two members that will be joining, and that will probably be the countries which I mentioned. But of course, a lot can happen. A lot, I do believe, still depends on how the war in Ukraine will end. If there is a success, Ukraine is successful and Russia is pushed out, Ukraine does manage to get its control back over its sovereign territory. This could be a game changer, and we could see things move relatively quickly in terms of Ukraine. And with Ukraine, they could be pulling some other countries along with it into the European Union, including Moldova, for example. So there are different scenarios that we have to consider, and as you mentioned, also the different factors in countries which are still very skeptical in terms of enlargement. And we should not ignore the fact that there are still a lot of internal political issues inside the EU, and that some countries will be very hesitant to accept new member states.
And if in the case of Europe everything is relatively clear, what image do we have regarding the expansion of NATO to the east? With regards to Ukraine, how do you assess the prospect of Ukraine, of this country, joining the alliance before the war ends? And will an exception be made for Kiev, or maybe some new mechanism can be proposed? And if so, wouldn't that make the situation even worse?
With NATO, I think it's a bit different of a process because you have probably the most important decision maker which has a lot of influence on whether or not NATO enlargement could take place. And this is the United States, which doesn't have any input on EU enlargement. So there's that main difference there. And I do believe that as long as the war is taking place in Ukraine, Ukraine does not have a chance to join NATO into the alliance as a full member. It already has received this NATO EU Council. So there are very high level discussions that take place. The coordination between Ukraine and NATO is very also high level and very close. So it's the only thing that the only thing that Ukraine does not have right now is NATO membership in terms of its relations with NATO, which includes, of course, the most important security guarantee. I do think, again, everything really depends on the developments of the war. Whether or not Ukraine can achieve some success or full success really also depends. That will depend on what the path, what scenario will play out. I do think that there are chances for some other mechanism, security mechanism for Kiev, for Ukraine, which could involve security guarantees, possibly in exchange for a ceasefire peace agreement with Russia if there seems to be a long drawn out stalemate. But this wouldn't take place for at least a year, maybe longer. I think right now the current thinking in Brussels and in Washington is that we still are going to wait to see how well Ukraine can manage. The counteroffensive is continuing. It's very slow, but it is continuing. And can Ukraine make a breakthrough and get some successes and maybe force Russia to also to sit down at the table and agree to, instead of agreeing to Moscow's demands, actually Moscow for more agreeing to Kiev's demands. I think that would be important too.
Mr. Raikard, despite the promises given to the West, which the German foreign minister talked about, the leader of Azerbaijan initiated an attack against the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, which led to ethnic cleansing. Despite the violation of international commitments by Azerbaijan, the international community did not go beyond statements, beyond announcements. In your opinion, what is the reason for such restraint, and won't the lack of consequences for Azerbaijan give, let's say, a new light, let's say green light for a new aggression by Azerbaijan, at this time against the sovereign territory of Armenia?
Yeah, first off, I do want to say it was very tragic to see the scenes of the ethnic Armenians basically escaping as quickly as possible out of their homeland where they have been living for generations. And the reaction of the international community and the European community has been very, as you said, not much more than statements. This has been a massive displacement of people that there needs to be, I think, more reaction to. Why the EU hasn't or European community hasn't responded very well to this, I think it's very complicated and it's a very there are a lot of different factors involved. The fact that I think, that Nagorno-Karabakh is internationally recognized as a part of Azerbaijan makes a good excuse for no reaction to the situation. But it does, I think, as you mentioned, it does provide some opportunity for Azerbaijan to think about what its next steps should be, and this is very dangerous. I think the EU should be quite vocal in putting some statements out saying that it would not accept any further aggression. It's one situation when it was using force to retake Nagorno-Karabakh, but I think it would be a completely different situation if force was used against independent sovereign territory of Armenia. And I would see a more active role by the European powers, I think. But at the same time, we do have to keep in mind that there are a lot of other major geopolitical shifts taking place right now, which could be seen as cover for Azerbaijan. Of course, Russia's war against Ukraine takes a lot of attention away from Brussels. But even the situation now in Israel and Gaza and the Hamas attacks has taken a lot of time on the headlines and is pretty much the front page news. And also tensions between Serbia and Kosovo seem to have been growing over the last weeks. I think Baku might think that this is an opportunity to try to continue, but I really do hope that the European community can stand up and actually do more than just statements.
And by boycotting the five-party meeting planned in Grenada, Azerbaijan proposes to discuss the issues in Moscow, Georgia, bilaterally or in 3+3 format. As for you, what are the reasons for the attempts of Azerbaijan to change the negotiating table, and what effect can the quadrilateral statement have on the process?
Yeah, I think Baku used the excuse of France siding with Armenia as the reason not to attend the discussions in Granada. I think it was a big mistake. I think right now Baku feels empowered because it used force and it managed to achieve its aims in Nagorno-Karabakh, so it doesn't feel that it needs to participate, at least at the moment, in any sort of formats that are imposed on it. It wants to have more say on what the formats will look like. So I do think this is one of the reasons why Azerbaijan wants to change the negotiating table. But I believe that the best formats that can create kind of longer lasting peace and maybe a roadmap for some sort of stability in the region would be EU together with Armenia and Azerbaijan. I don't see any other format that could really be effective in this. We should remember, that, and it's unfortunately forgotten by so many people, but the European Union is founded on dialogue and reconciliation to overcome conflict. And these are very important values that are embedded in the European Union. But the European Union itself is failing to adhere to these values, in my opinion. So I think there has to be more efforts to bring Baku back to the table with equally with Yerevan and mediated by Brussels, and actually create some sort of roadmap which includes carrots and sticks, which would lead to strong dialogue and more stability and peace in the region, and really lowering also the tensions. And of course, also, finding a way to be accountable for some of the negative actions which took place in the region. I think that also needs to be addressed. I also believe that it's very important to leave Moscow out of the formats, because the Kremlin has its own interests in the region, and I think that their interests often clash with the notion of peace. So I do not think that, looking at Moscow as some sort of alternative to a negotiating party, or a mediator in the conflict, I think this would be a mistake. Moscow has proved itself to be untrustworthy. I think even just the last month or two has proven that it did not fulfill its obligations, which it had promised from 2020. So, I hope that things can cool for a moment, and the negotiation and table and the format really is driven by Brussels.
And another important announcement was made in Grenada. We're talking about the joint statement between Pashinyan and von der Leyen. How do you assess it in terms of the perspective of development of relations between Armenia and the European Union?
I mean, this is very positive. It was a very positive development. I think, we have to recognize that Russia's influence in the region is diminishing. It's decreasing, and this is an opportunity for stronger relations between Armenia and the European Union. I think that there should be greater focus on this through the different formats that we've already talked about, not just the European political community, but we do have the Eastern Partnership format, which many people don't talk about lately. But a very important part of that, I think, is related to civil society. Look, I think Armenia is in a very difficult position right now. Difficult politically, geopolitically, difficult, the security situation. There still is, some Russian presence there, but I think there are perspectives to bring Armenia closer to the EU. And it's not just, of course, the EU side, which is responsible. I think that I do believe that Armenia has a strong civil society, and that this can be a very important player in this process, and not only advance the democratic developments inside the country, but also help bring Armenia and Armenians closer to the EU. A lot of these developments have already started, even over the past years. And I think now with a weaker Russia in the region, with the conflict, hopefully there will be also an opportunity to engage, use this process to engage in more dialogue, as we already have talked about. But I do think that there is some positive developments here, and the statements that were made in Granada show that there is opportunity, and let's hope that this opportunity is taken advantage of.
Thanks for the interview, Mr. Rijkaard.
Thank you.
Today I was talking to Adam Rijkaard, the editor-in-chief of New Eastern Europe magazine. Thanks for watching us.